Hi, Emily Baker here, curator with the Art Gallery of St. Albert, part of the Arts and Heritage Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to today's virtual tour of Enticement by Edmonton's Amanda McKenzie. For today's tour, we'll be taking a look at this very special staircase exhibition, which was hosted at the Art Gallery of St. Albert from May 11th until August 5th, 2021. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we will dive into the magical world of Amanda McKenzie's created creatures. So, Enticement is an exhibition that includes several cleverly fabricated creatures that are meant to entice and allure the visitor. Amanda McKenzie fuses images of aquatic creatures with the very bait that is used to attract and capture them. The show exists in a murky waters between the natural world and the synthetic, while Amanda McKenzie's work engages in an active mimicry. Deceiving and misdirecting the viewer, the pieces are meant to confuse the presumed reality of one's initial perceptions. But before we dive into all of the fine details involved with this work, I wanted to introduce you to the artist herself. So Amanda McKenzie is an Edmonton visual artist who specializes in printmaking. As you can see, there's a lot of exploration and creativity and curiosity involved in her pieces, and we'll dive into a lot of that information in depth. She earned her Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Alberta in 2012, and that year she also held SNAP's Emerging Artist in Residency, which resulted in a solo exhibition at SNAP Gallery as well as at Nest Gallery in 2013. And Amanda McKenzie's work have been exhibited in group exhibitions in Edmonton, St. Albert, Calgary, Kelowna, Ottawa, Vancouver, as well as internationally in Poland. Along with being a practicing artist, Amanda is a fierce advocate for the arts in Edmonton and does a lot of that through her employment with Snap Gallery as their print and programs coordinator. And so for those of you who don't know, SNAP is the Society of Northern Alberta Print Artists. And if you're interested in printmaking at all, they are a phenomenal resource in Edmonton, providing both exhibitions, programming, studio and workshop space to print artists and print enthusiasts alike. And so if you haven't had the chance, they're a fabulous resource, and I really encourage you to check them out. Amanda has also been an active member with the St. Albert Paper Arts Guild and has taught programs with Ridger College Summer Arts Series, the Art Gallery of St. Albert, Gallery at 501, the City Arts Center, and Smeltzer House. And she was actually previously the Community Programs Coordinator here at the Art Gallery of St. Albert. So in the summer of 2019, Amanda McKenzie spent some time at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, in their printmaking department working on UV screen printing techniques. And a lot of that is going to play into this series of work that she's created for our exhibition space. And so I'm going to play a video for you that gives you a good sense of what it's like to come up into the gallery space and see this work for yourself in person. And so she was awarded a grant, a project grant, to create the exhibition Enticement by the Edmonton Arts Council, and we are both incredibly grateful for that support. So to introduce you to Enticement, I'm going to start you off with a quote from the artist. My manipulation of color, imagery, material, and paper evoke the vibrancy of aquatic life and calls for closer inspection to discover the true nature of the image. It is my intention that this process of discovery allows viewers to consider their own connections to the small life that lives among us. And so as you can see, Enticement is a printmaking installation. The works are installed on the walls and windows of the Art Gallery St. Albert's staircase feature space. This is the first exhibition of this body of work, but this is an ongoing exploration, so this work is by no means finished. And the ideas at play within Enticement evolve a lot of different questioning and ideas within the artist's thought. So this is a continued exploration and evolution of her thinking on these works. So there are larger fish spread across the three walls, and they interact and mix with smaller hybrid insects, fish, and lures, which are all very clear amalgamations. So all of the works in this exhibition are hybrid creatures, blending the imagery of natural creatures from the world around us with lures and fly ties that are ultimately meant to attract and trap them. So to quote the artist, the work focuses on the falsities of perception. I enjoy creating work that appears to be one way, but on closer inspection, the viewer can investigate and discover the true nature of the image. I'm interested in how the viewer engages with my work, by what attracts them, but also what is successfully deceptive. End quote. And throughout the creation of this series, Mackenzie has been developing her knowledge of the natural world, learning about fish, insects, and birds, as well as the ecological systems that support them. And so the works are about discovery of the natural world, exploration, and asking questions. The artist's intention is not to resolve or sort of cement these ideas, but rather use the work as an ongoing process of learning and questioning. And so this is a really interesting concept of using your artistic practice as a form of research. And Mackenzie says that this is quite counter to how she was taught in university, wherein one does research and sketching and finalizes all the ideas before one finishes up their process and creates any products. And so Mackenzie really enjoys this ongoing nature of the work and sort of this continued exploration and the flexibility to allow her thoughts and her ideas and her questions to continue to explore. So where did the series start? As you can see on the screen now, there are 3 early prints from this series dating back to 2018 and 2017. And so what I wanted to introduce you to was a bit of a through line and a bit of a background on Mackenzie's art practice. She's always been very interested in nostalgia and memory, and her previous series of works, Fragmentations, were very much exploring these ideas of memory and connection. And this time they were focused on the home. And so you can see here that these 2 pieces that were part of this fragmentation series are looking at the house and the home, but they, like Enticement, are not completely structurally identical to how we experience his home now. So she's taking these fragments of houses, so staircase, doorways, entryways, windows, and using them and blending them with materials we might find within the house, so doilies and lace, and using that as a site of memory and a site of exploration, sort of alluding to nostalgia and memory. And this is also playing out in the beginnings of Enticement. And so when Mackenzie first started to look for a new series to explore, it was to participate in a printmaking exchange program. And she wanted to break from her previous series. She wanted to create something a little bit more colorful. And so she started to look to the lures and fly ties that she had laying around that were left to her by her late father. And so her father was an avid angler and taught her how to fish and took her, and some of her fondest memories are fishing and exploring the natural world with her family when she was young. And so she thought of an interesting way to amalgamate these images would be to combine scan images of some of these lures with images of some of the creatures they're meant to attract. The first piece would have been shark bait, which you can see on the left. And it's an image that she found in a magazine of a shark, which has been ripped and torn into 3 pieces and sort of combined with these classic fishing hooks to create a hybrid lure that sort of deceives and attracts the viewer in equal parts. Mackenzie really enjoyed the color and the vibrancy of this creative process, as well as the variation and infinite combinations that she could use. And so while that idea and memory of her father and learning and living with him early in her life and learning how to fish with him is part of this exhibition, it is no means the only driving force in the show. It's sort of a little bit of memory and flavor added in to give some context. And so when she was wanting to create more works for this exhibition, she wanted to study a few different ideas and explore a few different concepts in the work. The first, as you can imagine, is that she was really interested in the natural world. She wanted to take a look at the environments that are around us, places we might not have access to, so creatures that live under the water, and present them in a way that was enthralling to the viewer. She was also very curious about the collective habits and collecting habits in the world of sport fishing and aquaria, which we will get into. And she also wanted to create a place where she could continue to question her own personal ethics of her practice within those environments, so within sport fishing and within fish keeping itself. And lastly, she really wanted to explore the physical materials of the work themselves. So playing with color and inks and textures in different ways to create a new experience for the viewer that they might not have thought about or experienced otherwise. And so all of these different ideas are at play within Enticements. But the first place we're going to start is with this idea of fishing, fly fishing, fishing lures, and aquaria. And so Mackenzie's fascination with fish keeping actually started with a happenstance. And so she won a betta fish in a mason jar at a Christmas gift exchange one year. And so while she put it into a larger tank and tried to give it a better habitat when she got it home, unfortunately this fish did not survive. And upon doing a little bit of research, she found that many betta fish within the commercial pet trade are not well kept, and it's a very difficult life for those small creatures. Often they're not transported safely, and they're kept in containers that are much, much too small. And so this leads to a lot of stress for the creature, and oftentimes these creatures pass away prematurely because they're not being kept in proper environments. And so, whilst Mackenzie ended up with all of this fish keeping equipment and she'd armed herself with a little bit of research, she was fascinated by these beautiful creatures. And she started to collect her own collection of fish, starting with a 5-gallon tank filled with silvery minnows, guppies, and an assortment of other creatures. This quickly upgraded to a much larger enclosure, and her partner are now avid collectors of little fish and have so many they've actually stopped naming them. And so Mackenzie is really entranced by the way that the fish move, their seemingly infinitely varied patterns, and the wonderful colors and textures that change really dramatically throughout the fish's lifetime. She loves spending time just watching the fish move and being inspired by their color. And so she asks herself many questions about whether her keeping these fish in a well-informed manner, but still keeping them in captivity, is something that is ethically okay for her to do. So she's still wrestling with the ethical lines of how does one balance their love for the beauty and diversity of these tiny creatures while ensuring that keeping them isn't doing more harm than good. Another area that I mentioned earlier in this exploration of the work is the idea of fly fishing and fly tying. And so you can see in these pieces, particularly in the smaller pieces, that they are obviously blended with fishing hooks and lures. And so something that Mackenzie is very interested in is sort of this history of creating fly fishing lures and fly ties. And so as she delved a little bit further into this world, of fly fishing and exploring how the flies that her father left her were created and starting to collect more for her own visual reference, she stumbled upon the sort of obsessive collecting habits of some people within the fly fishing community. And so, to give a little bit of a primer, Mackenzie's primarily interested in two different types of fly fishing. And so, the first is to attract trout, and the second is to attract salmon. Both of these methods of fly tying are based within European contexts and sort of were first developed in the UK and in Europe and then spread to North America with colonialism in the 17th and 18th century. And so the first that we're going to look at here are trout flies. And so you can see here they are meant to mimic insects. And so if you're wanting to catch a trout through fly fishing, you need to fool the trout into jumping out of the water into for something that it thinks is food. And so you want to fool the trout into thinking that it's jumping for a insect or a larva or some other thing that it is familiar with at that time in its life. And so this requires a lot of knowledge on the part of the fly fisherman who needs to know what kind of insects are living in what kind of streams, what kind of insects are the food for what kind of trout at what time of year, all of which develops a vast body of knowledge and influences what kind of ties will work at that time of year to attract the fish. You can see here that these two are definitely meant to mimic insects and fool the fish into jumping out of the water. The second type of fly is much more flamboyant and they're much larger, and they are meant to attract salmon. And so, if salmon are in a river rather than in the ocean, it's because they're preparing to spawn, they're preparing to breed. And so, they're not quite as interested in eating as they are in mating. And so, in order to trick a salmon into jumping out of the water at your fishing lure, you need to sort of antagonize it. It won't necessarily jump for something that it thinks is food, but it will jump at something that it finds as a threat or something that might encourage an aggressive response. And so you can see with these two lures here that they are very ostentatious and they're very colorful. In the 18th century, there was a lot of feathers flowing into the UK from all over the world because of the expansion of the British Empire. And so one of the marks of colonialism at the time was not only expanding British influence across the globe, but also bringing back exotic animals and creatures from other locale. And so anglers and fly tyers became obsessed with exotic feathers from all over the world. And they created recipes on how to create these fly ties and how to tie them properly. These recipe books are still in use today. And so there are some members of the fly tying community that are fascinated by this historical use of fly ties and are very enthralled with trying to capture and recreate these classic tie lures. And so this is something that Mackenzie finds really, really interesting. This obsession with wanting to create and catalog fly ties, not necessarily for the act of fishing, but for the enjoyment of tying the fly alone. Several of the people who are most well renowned for tying these fishing ties don't actually use them for fishing. They enjoy them just for the sheer act of creating the fly ties themselves. And so Mackenzie was quite enthralled with this idea and found it to be a beautiful parallel with her own work, exploring color and form and the minutiae and tiny details and tiny variations that can come with creating an artwork. And so you can see here in Cardinal Tetrafly that she's taken scanned images of a fish and then swapped out its fins for the feathers that you would find on a normal fly lure. And so you can see the hook on the tail fin, but also this wonderful collection of different colored feathers and tinsel that make up the rest of the fins here. And at first glance, you may not notice that the feathers, that the fins are in fact feathers, and so that kind of plays into that successful illusion that Mackenzie's wanting to create in these pieces. And so she finds it really interesting that her own pattern of behavior is sort of starting with a place of questioning. So starting with a place of being curious and wanting to question and learn more about these different types of materials. So whether that's fish keeping or fly tying. And then she starts to find that she's participating in these systems. And so she has started to collect her own series of fly ties and lures that she uses as reference images within her own practice. She also has a large collection of living fish that she keeps in her aquarium at home. And this idea of collection and participating then turns into self-critique and looking at these activities through an ethical lens and using her art making practice as a way of engaging with those questions, not necessarily needing to answer them right away, but sort of keeping her own practices and ideas in check. And so you'll notice that all of the creatures within enticement are hybrids. And so it's much easier to see in the smaller pieces that are part of this exhibition. And so you can see in Dragonfly Hula Grub that the top of the piece is a dragonfly, whereas the bottom is a grub lure, which sort of spins in the water. And well, the fly fishing trap is the top half is a classic fly, whereas the back half is one of those trout fishing lures that I mentioned previously. And so using these images to sort of blend creatures that are usually attracted by lures or mimicked by lures with the actual lures themselves. But if you'll notice, while it's very obvious in the smaller pieces that they are amalgamations and combinations, the larger pieces, it might be a little bit more difficult to spot. And so as you will have seen in the video, these larger fish are interspersed in amongst the smaller ones. And the larger pieces themselves are still hybrids and amalgamations, but not quite in the same obvious way that the smaller pieces are. And so with these, Amanda McKenzie is mostly playing with different variations of color and texture, as well as sort of the finished material product on the piece. And so if you looked at this marble million fish, it might look like a realistic fish on the outset, but if one was to get up close and take a really detailed look at it, you'll notice that there are several different layers of material application that have been used to create this. And so before this fish was even printed, Mackenzie was using marbled paper. So she was dyeing the paper that she was using to create a really unique and interesting texture, and then printing her colors to create the work over top of it. And how I will go into in detail how these works are created and printed. But Mackenzie's wanting to add things that are classically found in lures, so whether that's iridescence or metallics or neons. And so these are things that you'll find on a lot of classic fishing lures, whether they're little spots, shiny metallics, little neon pieces, that are not necessarily found in the same way on the traditional fish themselves. So if we look at Mackenzie's cobra copper-tailed guppy and compare it with a yellow cobra guppy, you'll notice that while the tail on the real fish is quite neon and quite bright, the body itself is a lot more pale and doesn't have those metallics and neon colors on it. Whereas on Mackenzie's fabrication, she's taken that neon color, which would be something you'd also find on fishing lures and fly ties, and spread it across the entire body, keeping those speckles and patterns and dots that are not natural to the original fish. And so as we're kind of looking at these different pieces, several of the larger fish also have material interventions. So they're not just flat prints themselves, but there are bits of rolled paper, lots of tinsel that have been added into the tails as well in order to create these really attractive creatures. And so one of the things she's questioning, she's really wanting to attract the viewer to take a closer look, using these fish as a lure for her own visual audience. So now that you know a little bit more about the pieces themselves and have a good handle on what's in the exhibition, I'd like to take you through how these works are actually created. And so this is a very long process that involves lots of different steps. And so it's a really interesting process in order to go through. So you kind of get a sense for how printmaking works, specifically UV silkscreen printing, and just how complex a lot of these amalgamations truly are. And so to get started, I'm going to leave you with another quote. So the artist writes, I scan the images of fish and reel tackle to create new amalgamations that could be perceived as ordinary fishing lures. I meticulously collage the images and objects together and silkscreen numerous altered color layers to result in shimmering iridescent creations of uncanny decoys. So in order to start this method of collage, you need source material. So she will go out and scan and photograph different insects, fishing lures, different types of textures and fly materials to create sort of a digital archive of source materials. So whether that is collecting physical insect specimens, as you can see there with the dragonflies on the left, or going through our old textbooks for different types of fish, photographing her own fish that she might catch, or scanning in images from different textbooks and reference resources. She then puts all of these pieces into Photoshop and collages and plays with the different sources until she has some amalgamations that she's quite happy with. Again, she wants them to dance on that line between initially looking like reality and having a more needing a closer inspection in order to discover what they truly are. And so another thing that happens in this Photoshop program, rather than just collaging the materials together, is that she's starting to separate out her color layers. And so what I mean by that is when Amanda McKenzie is screen printing, she's printing one color at a time in order to create a layering effect of color to create the illusion of an infinite variety of colors to the human eye. And so we'll go through this process in detail, but you can think about it very similarly to how your printer at home would work, where it's blending color layers in cyan, yellow, magenta, and then the key layer, which is black often, in order to create the illusion of an infinite variety of colors. And so in Photoshop, Mackenzie's able to put a bitmap onto her image. And what this means is it's a series of really teeny tiny dots. And so when she's separating out each of the color layers, each separate color layer will end up with its own sort of silhouette of tiny, teeny tiny dots. And once they're combined together with all four of those layers, you'll get an infinite variety of color. And so once she's separated the color layers out into different bitmaps, she prints them off onto acetate sheets, and then she starts to prepare her screens. And so when I mean screen printing, I really do mean printing using a screen. And the best way to go about this for UV screening is to prepare your image and prepare your screen. And so you'll see there on the left that all screens need to be cleaned before they're used in order to scrub off any old print screens that might have been on there and repair any minor damage that might have happened. The screen is then treated with a photosensitive material. And then you take those prints that we saw in the last step, which are on acetate, which is clear, and adhere them to the screen, as you can see on the right. And so when you expose this UV sensitive material to UV light, anything that's exposed to the light will harden, and anything that's underneath on that acetate layer that's covered by the printed materials will stay liquid. And so once the screen is exposed, you wash off any remaining liquid material, and you basically have a silhouette and a stencil of your intended image. And so what you need is to have each of those image layers printed out, and sometimes the fish are so large that she needs to print them in two halves. And so you can see here on the right, there are several of those Siamese fighting fly images being exposed on the screen at that time. The next step is to start thinking about and blending your colors. And so as I mentioned, Mackenzie is working in a cyan, magenta, yellow, and key layer process, but that doesn't mean that she's sticking to strictly pure cyan, magenta, and yellow. And so she really likes this process of printmaking because she's able to experiment with the different colors tint and push her cyan, magenta, and yellow into different areas in order to get an infinite array of results. So sometimes she'll use metallic and neon inks, as I had mentioned, and oftentimes she'll use more than just 4 layers, adding in iridescence and other textures in order to get an infinite variety of results. And so in order to give you a really good idea of how the printmaking process works, McKenzie provided us with this really lovely video that will show you how it happens. And so you can see the fish on the screen already has several layers that have been printed. And so McKenzie is setting it up in order to print the key layer, which is that last layer that adds in lots of fine details. Often it's in black, so that you can get really teeny tiny details and darkness and shadow areas. And so you can see here that she's carefully lining up her image in order to create a really exact print of where the piece should go so that all those color layers are stacking appropriately. She then takes the ink and pulls that black ink across the screen and then pushes it back across to flood the screen again so it doesn't dry out between prints. And you can see that those black details have been added onto the screen again. And so doing this in several processes allows you to build up those color layers. It builds up a really rich texture and vibrancy, as well as gives you a lot of different variations and ideas on how to create the pieces. And so McKenzie is really, really fascinated in these material processes. So not only creating these fish through this incredibly complex method of silkscreen printing, but also exploring printing onto different types of materials. And so while the large fish in this exhibition are printed using the silkscreen method, the smaller fish are actually printed onto an adhesive paper that has a similar texture to fabric. And that way they're able to be attached directly to the wall or to the window, but also reuse when needed. Once the fish are printed, McKenzie will go back in and start adding in her own material explorations. You can see on the left, we have that Siamese fighting fly, the green one that's on the wall. And she's building up different types of fabrics that are hand rolled. So she cuts them into strips, hand rolls them, adds in tinsel and other decorative materials in order to create that sense of texture underneath the fish's tail. You can also see that this fish had to be printed in 2 parts because it was too large for one screen, which means that she has to be very careful on how she's applying her inks and very, very meticulous in combining those images together. Part of her practice also looks at printing onto different types of paper. I mentioned using marbled paper earlier, but she also prints onto highly reflective surfaces, slightly transparent surfaces. And so you can see that this body of work is very much about exploration and playing with different colors and materials. She often jokes that her materials trolley feels like it belongs in a kindergarten class, the amount of glitter and tinsel that is present there. And so using a lot of these varied techniques allows her to have a really interesting array of results and also keeps her really engaged in the material process of creating these works. She says the infinite variety and exploration has kept her mind really focused on these pieces, as well as not trying to answer any of those questions we brought up earlier, but really using this as an exploration process. The last step to bringing enticement to the gallery space was really wanting to create this immersive space. As you'll notice when we're looking at the videos and photographs, this isn't your traditional sort of art presentation. They're not framed, they're not placed in sort of a linear way on the wall. They're really presented as being part of the staircase. So it's an immersive installation. And so in order to play with the layout, McKenzie actually created a tiny maquette of the exhibition space in order to play with the placement and layout of the fish. And she lent it to us so that when we installed the work, we could have a very precise map of how to put the pieces up in the staircase. And so that brings us back to coming full circle with the exploration of this show. And so you can see that Mackenzie's very interested in several different areas of questioning, whether that's the ethics of fish keeping, her own participation in collecting fly fishing ties and lures, and sharing the beauty of the natural world that people don't often get to experience in this way. And so she has said that through this series, she's only wanted to learn more about the natural world and sort of deepen her knowledge of different ecosystems, particularly fish, as they're particularly difficult to access if you don't actually keep fish. Fish live in an environment that is totally different from our own, and therefore she's fascinated by bringing that alien world into a gallery space. And so I'll leave you with one last quote. With my body of work, I am enthusiastically researching deeper into the areas of ichthyology, etymology, and ornithology as I choose, collect, transform, and reimagine my creations. And so she's fascinated by natural sciences, ichthyology being the study of fish, entomology being the study of insects, and ornithology, which will be a new branch of this body of work, the study of birds. And so to pursue this line of inquiry and research, Mackenzie's actually been participating in several different labs and residencies that are meant to combine artists and scientists in a similar space. And so in 2020, she participated in biophilia, which is a crash course in biology and ecology for artists through the Ayatana Research Center. And then this summer, Mackenzie's planning on taking part in the Shoals Marine Laboratory, which has an artist residency program. And that program is designed to bring artists and scientists together in order to share their research, collaborate, and learn from one another. So Mackenzie believes that there's so much that both disciplines can learn from one another, and she's aspiring to work more closely with scientists in order to learn not only about the natural world, but different methods of preserving and capturing specimens, as well as to deepen her own understanding of her subjects. There's always so much to be able to observe and be able to learn. She's also hoping that when the world is further away from the pandemic, artist residencies in zoos and aquarias will restart again, as it'll give her a really wonderful opportunity to engage with these creatures that have fascinated her for so long. And so, kind of in conclusion, there are several different ways that this installation can be engaging for the viewer. It's absolutely stunning, and there's a lot of different materials you can look at, as we know from her different material explorations. But there's a lot of different questions and research that Mackenzie wants the viewer to be engaged with. And so she wants viewers to be enthralled with her creations, but also to recognize that they aren't truly accurate to real life. She wants us to recognize that they are false creatures. And so while the larger fish are surrounded by more obvious hybrids, they're surrounded by creatures that look like lures and have these obvious methods of trapping fish in them, Mackenzie also wonders if these larger fish might be adapting to those falsities as well. And so she's putting in metallics and neons into the larger fish as possibly a nod to these fish evolving to be surrounded by lures all the time. And so she's wanting us to question whether these fish are becoming more like our synthetic lures because they're seeing them all the time, or are they becoming more like our synthetic lures because it's something that people find attractive. And so these questions and ideas are very open-ended, and the series is meant to evolve. And so with the interest in lure making and collecting material explorations and exploring the natural world, there's really an entry point for everyone in this series and in this body of work. And so Mackenzie hopes that the people who experience the work in person will be able to think more deeply about these smaller creatures and our shared planet. And they're beautiful and infinitely varied, but often they are set at a distance from our everyday lives and can often be quite elusive. And so this work is meant to share that beauty and provide a sense of connection with the natural world and the viewers of the artwork. So I did want to say thank you to Amanda McKenzie for sharing such an amazing exhibition with our gallery and for taking the time to be such a wonderful source of information for this exhibition tour. And so we will be hosting Enticements until Friday, August 5th, or Thursday, August 5th, sorry, after which point we will be switching over to a new exhibition in the Staircase Gallery. However, these online resources will be available on our website for a long time to come, and so there's always a chance for you to re-engage with the work through our virtual platforms. And so thank you very much for taking the time to watch today's virtual tour of Enticements, and I hope that you enjoyed yourself and learned a little bit more about Amanda McKenzie, silkscreen printing, and the natural world that lives around us. I hope you have a lovely afternoon, and we'll see you again soon.